Picture a spine, just a geographical spine made entirely of water, running exactly 1,450 miles.
It is a massive distance.
It really is. It starts high up in the freezing, jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and it carves its way down. It plunges through canyons and deserts all the way toward the Gulf of California in Mexico.
That is the Colorado River.
Exactly. This is the Colorado River. And along that massive winding descent, it supplies water to 40 million people. That spans across 7 U.S. states and 2 countries.
Which is just a staggering number of human lives attached to one single channel of water.
Right. But right off the bat, there is this jarring mathematical reality that you, as the listener, have to confront today. It is a massive red flag in the source material we are looking at.
Yeah, the river barely even reaches the ocean anymore.
It essentially dies in the desert before it can finish its journey. It just dries up. It is literally a ghost of a river at the end of its line.
Which really forces a completely different perspective on what this body of water actually is today. Because if you look at the Colorado River expecting a natural flowing ecosystem, you are looking at a phantom.
Right. The sources make that super clear.
Yeah, they do. The reality is that we are dealing with a highly stressed, heavily negotiated, and entirely over-allocated distribution network. It operates less like a river and far more like a colossal piece of infrastructure.
And it is buckling under the weight of the demands placed upon it. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Okay.
Because to understand how 40 million people are suddenly realizing their primary water source is failing, we have to look at the baseline math. Our mission for this deep dive is to dissect this massive slow-motion collision.
It is a collision of science, economics, legal power, and honestly, a staggering amount of human hubris, all piling up at once.
Exactly. And we are pulling from a really diverse set of sources today: hydrological reports, historical legal compacts, and economic analyses. To see the sheer scale of the engineering and the denial, we first have to establish the baseline of what the river used to be.
Right, because the sources paint a picture of a system that, about 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, operated on entirely different principles.
The contrast is basically night and day, right?
Completely. 10 millennia ago, the untamed Colorado River was violent. It was incredibly seasonal. The hydrology was driven by massive, roaring spring floods fueled by glacial melt in the Rockies.
And it wasn't just a straight line like a canal.
No, not at all.
Mm-hmm.
The channel itself wasn't a neat line on a map. It was braided, shifting constantly, just drooping across the landscape.
Yeah.
The governing principle was raw physics.
Entropy and gravity.
Exactly. The water moved where the terrain dictated. It carried millions of tons of sediment, which literally acted as an abrasive tool to carve out structures like the Grand Canyon. Nothing was owed to anyone, and nothing was negotiated. It was an ecosystem engineer, scouring out old riverbeds and laying down new, fertile sediment. It created these sprawling wetlands all the way to a vibrant delta in northern Mexico.
And when human beings first entered the picture, they weren't trying to boss that physics around.
No, they didn't have the technology to do that even if they wanted to.
Right. If you look at the pre-industrial era, at civilizations like the ancestral Puebloan culture or the Hohokam, they built their lives around the river. But the crucial distinction in the research is that they adapted to it.
Right. They adapted to it, rather than forcing the river to adapt to them. They engineered small-scale irrigation canals, but their overarching societal structure relied on seasonal adaptation.
So if it flooded, they just moved.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
When the river flooded, they utilized the floodwaters or moved to higher ground. When droughts inevitably hit, they adjusted their crop choices or migrated.
The river was just a fundamental physical constraint.
Exactly. You respected its rhythms, or your civilization collapsed. There was no illusion of total mastery. You negotiated with reality purely on the river's terms.
But then we fast forward to the 1900s, the industrial era.
Yeah, everything changes here.
We hit what the source material explicitly calls the domination phase. The American West decides it is done adapting to constraints. We basically decide we are going to make the hydrology bow to our economic ambitions.
And that is the entire foundation of the crisis we are sitting in right now. The reason those 40 million people are facing water shortages traces back to a single legal cornerstone.
From the 1920s, right? The Colorado River Compact.
Yes, the 1922 Compact. This is where the mathematical foundation of the river was permanently fractured. You had representatives from the states in the river basin gathering to divide up the water.
And the political motivation was pretty clear.
Oh, very clear. They needed a binding agreement so they could secure federal funding to start building big infrastructure. I mean, massive dams and canals. They wanted to do this without getting bogged down in endless interstate lawsuits.
So they just drew a line on the map.
Pretty much. They split the basin geographically.
Yeah.
The upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and the lower basin states, California, Arizona, and Nevada.
But the fatal error occurred in how they actually calculated the volume of water they were dividing up. They based the allocations on the river's flow during a specific window of time, right?
They did, and this is the core issue. They looked at the flow data from the early 20th century, which happened to be a historically unusually wet period.
Oh, wow. So they just assumed that was normal.
They assumed that anomaly was the baseline forever. As a result, they allocated far more water on paper than the river actually produces on an average year.
I mean, it sounds like writing massive recurring checks on a bank account based on the 1 month you got a huge corporate bonus. And now we are shocked the checks are bouncing.
That is a perfect analogy, but with the added caveat that we didn't just write a few checks, we legally bound our grandchildren to keep cashing them.
Even knowing the money wasn't there.
Right. The founders fully knew the account might not sustain it, but they made it structurally impossible to alter those allocations without a political earthquake.
Which created this massive divergence that the sources talk about between paper water and wet water.
Yes, exactly. The legal contracts, the paper water, dictate that a specific massive volume of water absolutely must be delivered. But the wet water, the actual physical snowmelt coming down the mountains, falls drastically short of those numbers.
And that distinction between rain and snowmelt is really critical here, isn't it? The Colorado isn't just a river you can refill with a few heavy rainstorms.
No, not at all. It is a snowmelt drilling system. The vast majority of the river's volume depends entirely on snowpack accumulating in the Rocky Mountains over the long winter months.
So it builds up and then releases slowly.
Right. When that snow melts in the spring, it acts as this slow-release reservoir, filling the river over time. The health of the river relies entirely on three specific factors:
Which are?
how much snow falls, when it melts, and the temperature during that melt.
Okay. Which brings us to the modern hydrological crisis. Because the math from 1922 was already flawed based on that wet anomaly.
Exactly.
But now we have introduced two massive accelerators that are actively breaking the physical mechanics of that snowmelt. I'm talking about the megadrought and climate change.
And those two forces are brutal. Since the year 2000, the basin has been trapped in a megadrought.
And the sources mention tree ring data for this, right?
Yeah, tree ring data gives us a climate record going back over a millennium. It indicates this is the driest period in 1,200 years.
That is just terrifying.
No.
1,200 years.
It is. But it isn't just a lack of precipitation. It's the systemic warming of the entire region.
Yeah.
Warmer atmospheric temperatures mean a larger percentage of winter precipitation falls as rain rather than snow.
And rain just washes away.
Exactly. Rain runs off quickly. It doesn't provide that sustained, slow-release flow that the river needs to survive the summer. Furthermore, warmer air just bakes the soil.
So it gets super dry.
Bone dry. So when the snowpack finally does melt, the parched earth acts like a giant sponge. It absorbs a massive fraction of the runoff before it ever reaches a tributary.
And then whatever water actually makes it into the reservoirs just evaporates faster because it's hotter.
You've got it. Higher temperatures drastically increase evaporation directly off the surfaces of the reservoirs. So you have a perfect storm. The actual flow of the river has dropped roughly 20% compared to the 20th century average.
20% less physical water. But the paper water, the legal contracts demanding those millions of gallons, hasn't shrunk an inch.
Not 1 inch.
The law of the river, this incredibly dense patchwork of treaties and compacts, essentially codified a total fiction, and you cannot litigate your way out of physics.
You really can't. Nature always wins that argument.
Right. So because we promised water that physically didn't exist, we had to build an absolutely unprecedented machine to try and force the river to comply with our faulty math.
We literally turned a living ecosystem into a highly regulated plumbing system.
That is wild to think about.
It is. To guarantee that water would be delivered exactly when and where the contracts dictated, regardless of whether it actually snowed that year, we built landscape-altering infrastructure.
We are talking about the massive dams.
Right. We built the Hoover Dam in the 1930s, which backed up the river to form Lake Mead. Then we built the Glen Canyon Dam in the 1960s, creating Lake Powell.
And then we had to move that water out of the desert.
Exactly. From those massive storage tanks, we carved aqueducts like the All-American Canal. That cuts right across the desert to feed Southern California.
And the Central Arizona Project, too.
Yes. The CAP is a staggering feat of engineering. It literally physically pumps water uphill to supply Phoenix and Tucson.
Logistically, what we did was convert time into storage. We took the unpredictable, chaotic spring floods and trapped them behind millions of tons of concrete.
We transform them into a controlled, on-demand supply.
But the trade-off for that control completely devastated the natural mechanics of the river, right?
Completely. By entirely suppressing the natural flood cycles, we protected growing desert cities from being washed out, and we guaranteed a steady, year-round flow for agriculture. But the ecological cost was near total.
Because the dams trap everything.
Yes, dams act as massive, impenetrable traps. All that sediment, the mud, the silt, the nutrients that used to flow downstream to build the riverbanks, create sandbars, and feed the delta, it all gets trapped behind the concrete walls.
So the water that eventually gets released through the dam is fundamentally altered.
It emerges cold, clear, and hungry.
Hungry water. That's a creepy phrase.
It is, but it's scientifically accurate. Because it has been stripped of its sediment load, the water actively scours the downstream riverbeds. It erodes away the remaining sandbars without replacing them.
And that sudden shift completely derailed the evolutionary adaptations of native species. The sources bring up a specific fish here, the humpback chub.
Yeah, the humpback chub is a perfect example. This is a fish that evolved over millions of years specifically to thrive in warm, muddy, turbulent, flashy floodwaters.
And we basically deleted its environment overnight.
We did. Suddenly, its entire environment is replaced by a highly regulated, sterile flow of cold, clear water released from the bottom of a dam.
So the humpback chub, alongside numerous other native species, was pushed to the brink of extinction, simply because the physical properties of its habitat were engineered out of existence.
The ecosystem was entirely starved to prioritize human predictability.
But the machinery gets even more complicated, because these dams aren't just holding tanks. They are the foundational backbone of the region's electrical grid.
Right. We are talking about massive hydroelectric power generation here. Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam generate enormous amounts of electricity by letting water fall through massive internal penstocks.
Which spin these massive turbines.
Exactly. But the physics of that process requires a minimum amount of water pressure. In engineering, this is known as head.
So the water level has to be a certain height?
Yes. You need the water level in the reservoir to be physically high enough above the turbines to push the water through the system with sufficient force.
And as this megadrought drags on, shrinking the reservoirs by 20%, we are approaching lines on the concrete that engineers never thought we would actually see.
Lines that were purely theoretical when they built the dams.
The source research uses two terms that sound incredibly ominous to me: power pool and dead pool. Let's break those mechanics down for the listener.
Sure, mixed minimum power pool is the specific water elevation level below which the turbines simply cannot generate electricity.
Because the pressure just isn't there.
Right. The water pressure drops too low to spin them. If Lake Mead or Lake Powell drops below that line, the power shuts off. You instantly lose a critical source of clean baseline energy that millions of people and businesses rely on.
And then below that line is an even more severe threshold: dead pool.
Dead pool is terrifying. That is the point where the plumbing physically breaks.
Wait, like the water just stops moving entirely?
Exactly. Dead pool is the elevation where the water level drops below the lowest intake valves on the dam. At that point, the water physically cannot flow out.
It just sits there.
It becomes a stagnant, trapped puddle sitting behind a massive concrete wall. The river downstream simply stops. The cities, the farms, the ecosystems, everything below the dam gets absolutely nothing.
Are we actually preventing disasters with all this massive engineering, or are we engaging in systemic risk laundering? Like, we hide the natural seasonal risk of a dry year today just to guarantee a much, much bigger systemic collapse tomorrow.
I think the concept of risk laundering captures the dynamic perfectly. We have successfully traded short-term volatility for long-term catastrophic fragility.
And the sources call that compound risk, right?
Yes. In systems engineering, this is analyzed as compound risk. When a natural, unengineered river experiences a severe drought, the failure is localized.
The ecosystem suffers a bit.
Right, perhaps a local civilization struggles, but the system inherently recovers when the rains return. But when an engineered system of this colossal scale fails, the failures stack and multiply across different sectors.
Walk me through what a stacked failure actually looks like on the ground. Say we actually hit power pool.
Okay, imagine the drought persists, and the reservoir elevation drops below minimum power pool at Glen Canyon Dam. Suddenly, the regional grid loses a massive chunk of electricity.
And that usually happens when it's hottest, right?
Inevitably. It happens during a summer heat wave, because that's when evaporation is highest. So just as the power supply drops, the energy demand for air conditioning spikes to life-threatening levels.
Oh man, so the grid is just screaming for power that isn't there.
Exactly. And simultaneously, because the region is baking, water demand spikes. Cities and massive agricultural operations are pulling harder on the remaining water supply.
But the water quality is dropping too.
Right, because the reservoirs are critically low, the physical quality of the water degrades. Pollutants, agricultural runoff, and natural salts become highly concentrated. There is simply far less volume to dilute them.
So in one cascading event, you have a severe water shortage, a regional energy crisis, massive economic damage to agriculture, and a looming public health issue with water quality.
All striking the Southwest simultaneously. The infrastructure doesn't just fail. The entire societal framework built on top of it fractures.
The central tension here is that by stabilizing the river for human economic output, we inherently destroyed the natural resilience of the system. We replaced a flexible ecosystem with a brittle, rigid machine.
A machine that only functions as long as the water stays above a very specific line on a concrete wall.
And this really forces us to examine the economics of that machine. If we have built this colossal plumbing system that threatens to trigger a multi-state blackout just to move water around, who is actually getting the water?
This is where the math completely upends what you might expect.
Oh, totally. Because when you hear about the Colorado River running dry, the immediate mental image is millions of people in Los Angeles or Las Vegas taking excessively long showers.
Or overwatering lush suburban lawns.
Right. But urban usage is a surprisingly small fraction of the story. The silent dominant force draining the basin is agriculture. 70 to 80% of the Colorado River's water goes directly to farming.
The sheer volume is staggering. And we are not talking about small, local vegetable patches feeding the surrounding communities.
No, this is massive industrial-scale agriculture.
Yes. It is concentrated in incredibly arid regions like the Imperial Valley in California and portions of central Arizona. To understand the strain on the river, you have to look at the specific logistics of what they are growing.
The dominant crops are incredibly water-intensive: almonds, cotton, and the absolute undisputed king of the basin, alfalfa.
Right. And before we go further, we need to clarify why alfalfa is such a massive issue here.
Yeah, let's explain that. Alfalfa isn't just a plant you water once and harvest.
No, it's a perennial forage crop. It is used primarily for livestock feed. And the reason massive agribusinesses grow it in the Imperial Valley isn't because the valley naturally has water.
Yeah.
It is a bone-dry desert.
They grow it there because the valley offers 350 days of blistering sunshine.
Exactly. 350 days of sun and virtually no frost. If you can artificially pipe the water in from the Colorado River, the climate allows you to harvest alfalfa 7, 8, sometimes up to 10 times a single year.
Which is insane. In a normal climate, you might get, what, 2 or 3 harvests?
2 or 3, exactly.
Yeah.
They're using the desert sun as an agricultural engine and using the river as the fuel.
But the output of that engine is what makes this so surreal to me. We're taking a dying river, pumping it across the desert to grow hay, and then, according to the research, a massive portion of that alfalfa doesn't even stay in the United States.
It doesn't. It is balled up, put on cargo ships, and sold on the global market.
To places like Saudi Arabia and China, right?
Yes. Massive quantities are shipped to Saudi Arabia, which depleted its own groundwater aquifers decades ago, or to China to feed their expanding dairy and beef herds.
This creates a deeply controversial economic dynamic that the sources call virtual water export.
Right. Because if you are an international buyer, you aren't really buying hay. You are buying the water required to grow it.
You are effectively importing the Colorado River, packaged in a dense green bale.
Precisely. We are exporting the lifeblood of the American Southwest to the other side of the planet, and it is heavily subsidized by outdated legal frameworks.
Subsidized because the cost of the water doesn't reflect the reality of how scarce it actually is.
The pricing mechanism is entirely divorced from reality. This is the first of 3 massive structural distortions in the river's economy. Mispriced water.
So these farms aren't paying city rates for water.
Oh, not even close.
Yeah.
Many of these massive agricultural operations operate on legacy contracts established nearly a century ago. They receive their water for pennies on the dollar compared to the rates that modern municipalities pay.
So because the water is artificially cheap, there is virtually zero economic incentive for these operations to invest in expensive conservation technology.
None whatsoever. The rational economic choice is to grow whatever crop yields the highest profit per acre, even if it requires literally flood irrigating a desert field in the middle of summer.
And if someone points out how wildly inefficient that is, these operations are legally shielded by the second major distortion, legacy rights.
Right. Western water law operates heavily on precedent. The older your legal claim to the water, the more bulletproof your right to extract it.
So an agricultural district from 1905 has all the power.
Exactly. An agricultural district that established its water rights in 1905 has its delivery guaranteed. Meanwhile, a modern, rapidly growing city that established its rights in the 1960s might be the first entity legally forced to take cuts during a shortage.
The entire economy of the river is legally shackled to the past. It just willfully ignores the hydrological realities of the present.
It does.
So if the water is practically free for legacy farms and they're legally immune from early cuts, what stops them from just polluting the watershed or draining it dry? Is there any penalty for the ecological damage?
That is the third distortion. Externalized environmental costs. When a massive agricultural operation drains a tributary or allows pesticide and fertilizer runoff to seep back into the watershed, they do not pay for the resulting ecosystem collapse.
They don't pay for the declining fisheries or the loss of biodiversity?
No, those immense costs are quietly pushed onto the public ledger, onto downstream communities, and ultimately onto future generations.
Okay, so agriculture is consuming up to 80% of the water, largely insulated by cheap prices and legal armor. But we can't let the cities off the hook completely.
No, we definitely can't.
Because Las Vegas, Phoenix, Los Angeles, these are sprawling metropolises in the middle of incredibly hostile environments.
They represent what the analysis calls the urban illusion. Think about the geographic reality of Phoenix or Las Vegas.
If you dropped several million people into those basins without the massive imported stability of the Colorado River aqueducts, those cities would collapse in a matter of days.
They would. They exist in environments that possess zero natural carrying capacity for that scale of human habitation.
Yet, if you walk through a high-rise casino in Vegas, the illusion of abundance is flawless. You turn on the tap, and sanitized water flows endlessly.
You look out the window and you see enormous artificial lakes and manicured golf courses defying the desert heat.
But the sources do point out that cities like Vegas are actually doing some impressive things behind the scenes.
Yes, and to be rigorously fair to the municipalities, places like Las Vegas have become marvels of urban water efficiency.
Right, they recycle a ton of water.
Southern Nevada recycles nearly every single drop of indoor water used. If it goes down a drain, it is treated and returned to Lake Mead.
Which is amazing, but the overarching illusion still remains.
It does. Because the economic engine of the Southwest isn't failing because it is somehow inefficient at moving the water.
Yeah.
It is failing because it is perfectly executing the mandate it was designed for.
It is maximizing short-term economic output and endless urban growth, and deliberately deferring the long-term hydrological consequences.
Until the physical limit of the river literally forces the machine to stop.
So we have an economic system built entirely on the illusion of surplus, running on a river that has physically shrunk by 20%. When the math finally snaps, when the reservoirs drop to a point where there simply isn't enough wet water to satisfy the paper contracts, how does the system decide who gets cut off?
That is where it gets really ugly. It doesn't seem like a purely mathematical equation. It sounds like a brutal political knife fight.
Yeah, how does that actually play out?
It is arguably the most contentious legal battleground in the country. The mechanism for deciding who takes the pain comes down to a very rigid, deeply entrenched hierarchy of thirst.
And this power structure is mapped directly onto the geography of the basin and the historical law of the river. Now, just to remind you as a listener, we are looking at this impartially. We aren't taking sides between the states here, just reporting on the legal mechanics the sources outline.
Exactly. And the foundational layer of that power dynamic is just raw, unyielding geography, upstream versus downstream.
The upper basin versus the lower basin.
Right. The physics of the system inherently grant a massive advantage to the upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming. The snow falls in their mountains. The headwaters are in their territory.
They possess the physical ability to capture, divert, and utilize the water before gravity ever pulls it down toward the desert.
But the law heavily complicates that natural advantage, and it creates a highly adversarial dynamic, particularly within the lower basin states, California, Arizona, and Nevada.
Because down in the lower basin, it's no longer just about who is physically further upstream. It's about a legal weapon known as prior appropriation.
The doctrine of first in time, first in right.
First in time, first in right. Okay, how does that work?
This is a crucial mechanic to understand. The mechanism works like this.
Hmm.
Under Western water law, the entity that historically staked a claim and put the water to beneficial use first holds the senior right.
And any entity that came later holds a junior right.
Correct.
Logistically, how does that legal hierarchy dictate the reality between the states today? Who has the oldest rights?
It dictates the reality with immense friction. California, primarily due to its massive, incredibly early agricultural development in places like the Imperial Valley in the early 1900s, secured the most senior rights in the lower basin.
And they also legally secured the largest absolute volume of water, right?
Yeah, they did. Arizona and Nevada developed their major infrastructure, like the multi-billion-dollar Central Arizona Project, decades later. Therefore, their rights are legally classified as junior.
So when the water levels crash and the Bureau of Reclamation looks at the math and says, we have to declare an official shortage, we don't have enough water to fulfill the compact.
The resulting cuts are aggressively asymmetrical.
Because of that first-in-time doctrine.
Exactly. Because of that doctrine, the junior rights holders, Arizona and Nevada, are legally obligated to absorb the massive, economically painful reductions first.
While California just keeps drawing its water.
Pretty much. California's senior agricultural rights remain heavily protected and largely untouched until the crisis reaches a catastrophic level.
Which obviously creates immense interstate hostility. It is a rigid legal framework where the historical agreements of the past have metamorphosed into massive liabilities for newer, rapidly expanding populations.
But the states aren't fighting in a vacuum. There's a massive, looming authority hovering over this entire interstate conflict.
The United States federal government.
Yes. While the states possess their allocations, the federal government owns and operates the physical infrastructure.
So they literally hold the keys to the dams.
The Bureau of Reclamation controls the valves at Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam. So while the states endlessly litigate and negotiate over voluntary reductions, the federal government possesses the ultimate trump card.
If the states can't agree on cuts, the feds step in.
Exactly. If the states cannot reach an agreement to cut their usage enough to prevent the reservoirs from crashing into dead pool, the federal government has the statutory authority to override state sovereignty.
They can unilaterally dictate who gets cut and by how much, simply to protect the physical integrity of the dams.
And the complexity doesn't stop at the U.S. border. There is an international obligation tied to this shrinking river as well.
Right, the 1944 Water Treaty with Mexico.
That treaty legally guarantees Mexico a specific share of the river, 1.5 million acre-feet annually. But geography places Mexico at a severe disadvantage.
Being at the absolute end of the line.
Yeah. They historically suffered the worst downstream consequences of the American machinery. By the time the water crossed the border, it was often heavily degraded.
It was saturated with agricultural salts and toxic runoff from upstream farms.
And ecologically, the natural delta in Mexico, which used to be one of the most vibrant, sprawling desert estuaries on the planet, has been reduced to a dry, cracked, salt-stained desert for the better part of a century.
But when we look at the states, the federal government, and the international treaties fighting over priority, there is a glaring systemic exclusion embedded in this hierarchy.
The indigenous nations.
Yes, the indigenous nations whose lands encompass massive portions of the basin. And again, keeping our impartial lens here, the sources lay out how structurally unequal this setup is.
It represents one of the starkest disparities between legal rights and physical reality in the entire system. There are 30 federally recognized tribes within the Colorado River Basin.
And many of them, like the Navajo Nation, hold immense, legally validated water rights.
These rights are often anchored by a legal precedent known as the Winters Doctrine.
Let's clarify the Winters Doctrine for the listener because it completely shifts the definition of priority. This goes back to a 1908 Supreme Court ruling regarding the Fort Belknap Reservation, right?
Yes, 1908. The Supreme Court established that when the federal government created Native American reservations, it implicitly reserved enough water to make those lands habitable and agriculturally viable.
Even if that water wasn't explicitly mentioned in the treaties.
Exactly. And crucially, the priority date for those water rights is tied to the date the reservation was established.
Which, for many tribes in the Colorado Basin, precedes almost all major state and agricultural claims.
Technically, under the law, They hold the most senior bulletproof rights in the entire system.
But the reality on the ground doesn't reflect that seniority at all. They have the paper water, but they don't have the wet water.
They don't, because historically they were systematically excluded from the foundational negotiations.
Like the 1922 Compact.
Right. When the 1922 Compact was signed, dividing up the river, tribal rights were entirely sidelined. Over the following decades, while the federal government poured billions of dollars into building the Hoover Dam, the aqueducts, and the massive canals to serve off-reservation farms and expanding white municipalities, the infrastructure on the reservations was completely ignored.
It's like being handed a VIP ticket to a concert that confirms you have front row access, but the venue has no doors, the roads are blocked, and you physically cannot get inside. The legal right is mathematically useless without the infrastructure to access it.
That perfectly encapsulates the disparity. The consequence today is profoundly jarring.
Because people are actually living right next to the river without water.
You have a situation where a significant percentage of households on the Navajo Nation still lack direct indoor plumbing. Residents are forced to spend hours driving trucks to communal wells to haul water back to their homes in plastic tanks.
While living right next to a river system that is actively being piped hundreds of miles away to sustain artificial lakes and golf courses in Phoenix.
They hold the supreme paper rights, but they lack the physical infrastructure, the treatment plants, the pipelines, to convert that legal right into a flowing tap.
It is a stark, unavoidable reminder from the source material that while rights exist in the abstract realm of law, actual, tangible power exists entirely in infrastructure.
Infrastructure is everything.
So we've mapped out this massive macro-level system. We have a failing hydrology driven by climate change. We have colossal concrete dams holding back a starving ecosystem.
We have an economy that exports a dying river as cattle feed, and a rigid, often unjust legal hierarchy deciding who absorbs the pain.
But these massive systemic forces don't just exist in courtrooms or engineering schematics. They trickle down and dictate the literal sensory micro-reality of every single individual connected to this water.
The human experience of this river is totally fractured.
Because the way you experience the Colorado depends entirely on your economic and geographical position within that hierarchy.
The infrastructure physically dictates the psychology. Because the water is utilized in such vastly different ways, the daily reality of what the river means splinters drastically.
Look at the farmer. Say someone running a massive irrigation operation down in the Imperial Valley. For them, the river isn't a natural wonder. It is a relentless, ticking survival clock.
For the agricultural operator, water is a highly precise calculation of time, profit, and debt, measured meticulously in acre-feet.
Their daily sensory reality involves waking up before dawn to verify irrigation schedules with the local water district, not checking the natural weather forecast.
Rain is an unpredictable anomaly for them. The mechanical opening of the canal head gate is the only reality that matters. Their physical experience is the intense heat radiating off dry, laser-leveled soil, the mechanical grinding of the gates, and the smell of wet earth that is entirely engineered and intentional.
Psychologically, their entire generational livelihood is inextricably tethered to policy decisions and drought contingencies being debated in courtrooms hundreds of miles away.
They operate under the constant heavy knowledge that one severe federal cutback can bankrupt their operation overnight.
Contrast that high-stakes anxiety with the daily experience of the city dweller in Las Vegas or Los Angeles. For the urban resident, the massive dependency on this struggling river is completely invisible.
It is the ultimate manifestation of engineered detachment.
You just turn a chrome lever on your sink, and clean, perfectly pressurized, sanitized water flows out.
The urban resident showers, they brew coffee, they wash their cars, entirely disconnected from the snowpack levels in the Rocky Mountains. The sensory experience of the water is completely sanitized and domesticated.
There is zero tactile or visual connection to the violent, muddy source of that water. The only time that reality ever punctures their engineered comfort is when they turn on the evening news.
Yes, when they see the drone footage of Lake Mead.
The bathtub ring.
Exactly. They see that stark, massive white line of calcium carbonate spanning the Red Rock Canyon walls. That ring visually marks exactly how far the water level has plummeted over the last 2 decades.
It is a towering visual monument to the deficit. But even then, it is experienced through a screen, not as a physical lack in their home.
And then you have the indigenous resident, which we just outlined. For someone hauling water on the reservation, the experience of water is deeply exhaustingly physical.
It is the literal weight of a plastic tank sloshing in the back of a truck.
It is the time consumed by the journey, the constant low-level anxiety of managing extreme scarcity. But simultaneously, layered on top of that physical burden is often a profound spiritual and cultural reverence for the river.
A sacred relationship that is heavily burdened by the systemic injustice of how the water is distributed.
The juxtaposition is staggering. You have a demographic that reveres the water as a sacred life source, yet is forced to access it through arduous physical labor, while neighboring demographics access it effortlessly through a tap with virtually no cultural reverence whatsoever.
And what about the people who interact with the river purely for recreation, the tourist or the longtime fisherman?
The tourist experience is a highly curated temporary awe. They book a whitewater rafting trip through the Grand Canyon. They feel the shock of the freezing water released from the bottom of the dam. They hear the immense echo of the canyon walls, and they get a temporary, thrilling reset from their urban lives.
But it is fleeting. They go home.
They leave. The longtime fisherman or the local guide, however, experiences something much more melancholic. They experience what ecologists call a decline in motion.
Explain that. What does a decline in motion look like to someone on the banks?
It means they possess the baseline memory of what the river used to be, and they're forced to watch it slowly degrade. They notice the quiet, creeping loss of biodiversity.
So they see the fish populations dropping.
Yes, they notice that the native fish aren't spawning, that the insect hatches have shifted or disappeared because the water temperature is artificially regulated by the dam.
Ecological collapse is rarely a sudden, dramatic explosion. It is a slow, quiet fading. The fisherman notices the silence replacing the life.
That's tragic, really.
It seems like a cruel paradox to me. The more deeply dependent our civilization becomes on this river for our survival, the less we actually feel it. We have utilized massive engineering to systematically erase our awareness of the source.
That psychological distancing is the core of the crisis. We have taken the natural rhythm of the river, which used to be dictated by seasons, floods, and ecology, and we have replaced it with a schedule dictated by human demand.
The chaotic roar of a wild spring flood has been replaced by the steady mechanical hum of a hydroelectric turbine.
The muddy, shifting banks have been paved over with sterile, concrete-lined canals. We have completely distanced ourselves from the fundamental source of our survival, and distance breeds neglect.
We don't notice the system is failing until the failure becomes catastrophic. I think the reason we were able to engineer away our awareness so easily, the reason we could look at a living, violent ecosystem and decide to turn it into a tightly controlled plumbing system, is deeply tied to how we view it spiritually.
Or more accurately, how we don't view it spiritually.
Exactly. When you look at the Colorado River in the context of other major civilization-defining river systems globally, the differences in cultural and spiritual framing put our approach into sharp relief.
It's wild to compare this to other global rivers.
You look at the Nile in Egypt, where ancient societies literally built their entire calendars, their religion, and their agricultural rhythms around the predictability of its annual floods. They adapted to its cycles.
The Nile taught a civilization to embrace and expect natural predictability. Then you have the Amazon in South America.
The Amazon is defined by sheer, incomprehensible scale.
It is so massive, so overwhelmingly powerful, that human engineering is essentially a rounding error compared to its volume.
Yeah.
It simply defies total human control.
Or you look at the Ganges in India, which is protected, at least philosophically, despite its severe modern pollution struggles, by a deep, pervasive religious reverence. Millions of people view it as a literal deity.
The Ganges possesses a cultural armor of the sacred. But the Colorado River has none of those protections.
Physically, it is a relatively small river for the colossal amount of demand placed upon it.
Mechanically, it is entirely over-controlled. Virtually every single drop is legally accounted for and diverted. But philosophically, the Western expansionist culture that encountered it viewed it through a singular utilitarian lens.
It was viewed purely as an instrument of economic progress, the mythology of conquest, the idea that nature is an obstacle to be dismantled and put to work.
Precisely. If you look back to the late 1800s, explorers like John Wesley Powell navigated the Colorado. Powell was incredibly astute. He understood the fundamental aridity of the American West.
He knew it was a desert.
He explicitly warned Congress that there was simply not enough water to support widespread traditional agriculture. And he argued that development needed to be strictly, carefully organized around the natural boundaries of the watersheds.
But they completely ignored him, because his warnings contradicted the ambition of the era.
They brushed him aside. The dominant American mythology at the time viewed the harsh, arid landscape not as a constraint to be respected, but as an adversary to be conquered.
Rivers were wild, chaotic things that needed to be tamed, harnessed, and mathematically optimized.
Progress was explicitly defined as total domination over nature.
Hmm.
A river that ran all the way to the sea without being diverted into a canal or spun through a turbine was viewed as wasted water.
Which poses a terrifying philosophical question for us today. If a culture does not view its life source as sacred, if the river is just a ledger to them, a resource to be mathematically maximized, what mechanism actually stops them from exploiting it until it completely breaks?
That is the philosophical edge of this entire crisis. If a river is purely instrumental, if there is no spiritual, cultural, or moral constraint against overusing it, then exploitation is constrained solely by physical consequences.
And the danger of modern engineering is that it allows us to delay those consequences for decades.
We treat the Colorado River as if it is divisible into neat legal spreadsheets, completely ignoring the biological reality that it is an interconnected, living ecosystem.
We act as if a massive diversion upstream doesn't inevitably create a catastrophic deficit downstream.
We lacked reverence, we lacked restraint, and so now we are being violently forced into a reckoning by the physics of the planet.
And we are now face to face with that reckoning. The engineering has hit its physical limits. The 1922 math is permanently broken. The river has ultimately become a mirror for human behavior when a complex system is pushed to the absolute breaking point.
It is the ultimate psychological test of how a society responds to undeniable constraint. And the source material presents a fascinating psychological archetype to help analyze this exact dynamic.
They refer to it as the Devon archetype.
Yes, the Devon archetype. This perfectly captures the mindset that designed the modern Colorado River system. Let's break down who Devon is.
Devon represents the ultimate engineering hyper-optimization mindset.
This is a psychological profile that doesn't retreat from constraint. He actually thrives on it. When faced with a severe limitation, like a lack of water in a desert, Devon doesn't panic. And he certainly doesn't accept defeat.
He calculates.
He gathers the data, builds complex models, optimizes every available variable, and makes high-stakes, ruthless trade-offs to force the system to keep running efficiently.
So Devon looks at a bone-dry desert and a chaotic river and says, I can fix this reality with a massive concrete dam and a tightly calculated spreadsheet.
And the crucial thing to understand is that for a long time, the Devon mindset works brilliantly. That archetype successfully built the Hoover Dam. It allowed metropolises like Las Vegas and Phoenix to explode into existence.
It maximized agricultural output to feed millions. But the Devon archetype harbors a fatal systemic flaw. And what happens when Devon's spreadsheet hits reality?
The fatal flaw is believing that deeply understanding a system is the exact same thing as having total control over it.
Devon believes that if he can just gather enough data points, build a sophisticated enough algorithm, and pour enough concrete, he can literally master uncertainty itself.
But the dying river eventually shatters this illusion, because climate variability, thousand-year megadroughts, and compounding ecological collapse are not linear engineering problems.
They are wildly chaotic.
You simply cannot spreadsheet your way out of a permanently shrinking snowpack.
The river forces the archetype to realize he isn't the master of the board. He's just a participant in a system vastly larger and more powerful than his tools. So applying that to the actual reality of the Colorado River, the Devon archetype, which is essentially our current water management paradigm, has to face the future.
And the sources lay out 4 specific scenarios for where the basin goes from here. Let's walk through them.
Scenario 1, managed decline.
Managed decline is widely considered by experts to be the most realistic, albeit painful, path forward. This scenario involves a forced acceptance of reality.
It dictates strict, deeply painful, and permanent cuts to water usage across the board.
It means a massive structural reduction in agriculture farms, fellowing thousands of acres of fields and entire regions permanently transitioning away from thirsty crops like alfalfa.
It means municipalities pushing the absolute limits of water recycling, outlawing decorative grass entirely, and severely capping future growth.
The region shrinks its economic ambitions to match the actual physical hydrology. The river survives, but the era of limitless, unconstrained expansion in the American Southwest permanently ends.
It's a mandatory society-wide diet. Okay, scenario 2, technological override. This is the Devon archetype doubling down on control.
Exactly. This is the ultimate bet that human engineering and capital can outpace planetary physics one more time. It envisions massive, multi-billion-dollar investments in infrastructure.
Like what?
We are talking about building colossal coastal desalination plants in California or Mexico, and complex legal exchanges, swapping that manufactured water for river rights. It involves universal, hyper-advanced wastewater recycling programs.
It is an attempt to manufacture our way out of the deficit.
But the catch is that it is staggeringly expensive, incredibly energy-intensive, and requires decades to build time the river might not have.
You're just shifting the deficit. It's like taking out a massive high-interest credit card loan just to pay your mortgage. You haven't solved the debt. You've just transferred it from a water deficit to an energy and capital deficit.
It is a high-stakes, highly precarious gamble. Which brings us to scenario 3, system collapse.
The dark timeline. What does collapse actually look like?
This is the scenario where political tribalism prevents necessary adaptation. The states stubbornly refuse to agree on voluntary cuts, choosing instead to endlessly sue each other.
Meanwhile, the megadrought persists.
Because nobody reduces their draw, Lake Powell and Lake Mead plummet through power pool and crash into dead pool. The massive turbines grind to a halt.
The regional energy grid severely destabilizes, leading to rolling blackouts.
The water drops below the intake valves, and the river downstream literally stops flowing. Millions of acres of crops die. Municipal water supplies are catastrophically disrupted.
The federal government is forced to step in and forcefully seize control of the allocations, overriding state sovereignty and triggering a constitutional crisis.
It is a chaotic, cascading failure where the raw physics of hydrology violently defeats human law.
That relies entirely on human stubbornness, which history shows we have in absolute abundance. But there's a fourth scenario. The sources call it the least likely, but philosophically the most fascinating. Scenario 4, ecological rebalancing.
This represents a radical, near-impossible paradigm shift. It requires a civilizational admission that we were never actually in control to begin with.
It involves systematically dismantling the machinery of denial.
We are talking about modifying or entirely removing major dams, intentionally draining Lake Powell to bypass the Glen Canyon Dam. It means purposefully restoring the natural, chaotic, seasonal flood pulses.
To scour the riverbeds and heal the downstream ecosystems and the Mexican Delta.
It would require a massive voluntary reduction in human demand, giving the river back its autonomy and treating it as a living entity rather than a plumbing system.
It's the absolute antithesis of the Devon archetype. It's abandoning the illusion of control and returning to the pre-industrial mindset of adapting to the river, rather than forcing the river to adapt to us.
It would require a level of humility and restraint on a civilizational scale that we have rarely, if ever, demonstrated.
So what does this all ultimately mean? When I look at these four futures, it seems we are locked into a massive, high-stakes game of systemic Jenga.
We really are.
We've pulled out the critical foundation pieces, the natural flood cycles, the ecological balance, the actual baseline hydrology to build these towering, heavy economic metropolises at the top, and now the entire tower is swaying in the wind.
But instead of carefully dismantling the top to save the structure, we are desperately trying to engineer invisible blocks to jam back into the bottom.
And the ultimate lesson the Colorado River provides is that it is a physical manifestation of constraint. It forces a question. When human societies face undeniable physical limits, do they possess the wisdom to adapt and change their behavior?
Or do they double down on control, building more elaborate illusions until a catastrophic collapse forces them to adapt anyway? The archetype of control must eventually learn that true mastery is not the exertion of total control.
True mastery is possessing the wisdom to know exactly where your control ends and respecting the physics that govern you. We started this deep dive talking about a spine.
A 1,450-mile spine of water.
That sustains 40 million lives, but is slowly, quietly dying in the desert. We traced its evolution from the raw, violent, ecosystem-building floods of the Ice Age, through the monumental hubris of the 1922 Compact, and into the massive, concrete machinery of our dams.
We uncovered the deeply hidden, invisible economy of exporting this dying river across the ocean disguised as cattle feed, and we mapped out the rigid, often profoundly unjust legal hierarchies that will ultimately decide who absorbs the pain of the deficit.
The Colorado River is no longer just water moving downhill due to gravity. It is the ultimate case study of what happens when human demand relentlessly outgrows natural supply, but the entire legal and economic framework refuses to blink.
Pretending that the deficit doesn't exist.
Which brings this reality right back to you listening to this. You might not live in Las Vegas. You might not run an agricultural operation in the Imperial Valley. but you are completely surrounded by and dependent upon hidden systems, sprawling energy grids, complex global supply chains, fragile ecological foundations that sustain every aspect of your life.
And many of those systems are built on the exact same outdated assumptions of infinite abundance that may no longer reflect the physical reality of the planet.
If you had to design the future of this river, if you were the one put in charge of the broken math, you would have to make a brutal, unavoidable choice. You either drastically reduce demand and force millions of people to face severe economic pain right now, or you maintain the illusion of control, keep the taps running, and face a total, catastrophic system collapse just a few years down the line. The question isn't simply which one of those painful options you would pick. The real question is, what happens to a society when the people holding the power to make that choice aren't the ones who will ultimately absorb the cost?